in psychology, sex, you have to have animal and then three. So you can say human and then that's gonna be like cool classes. I mean, even if there is a lot of science and memorization, that's gotta be nice.
No, it's interesting. Answer all the questions. No, I didn't look that hard. I read it.
Exactly, that's what we should do it.
I do not love college.
First big question, folks. Anybody here who doesn't know there's a paper due on Thursday?
What?
Is there any? Yes, you have a copy you can sign.
I'm good. Why didn't you say something?
We are basically, sorry folks, whenever you're ready. We finished, in some sense, talking about free will and determinism last time. I'm not going to lecture on it anymore. But there's an essay by Peter Van Inwagen, which I'd forgotten I'd put on your syllabus. And the main reason it's there is that having gone through all this, for those of you who are curious about it, he does a very nice job of laying stuff out. And from that you can guess that I agree with him. That's why I think he does a nice job. But it's a very nice job of sort of laying out what the problem is. But this is not exactly humorous kind of point, but in fact it's not humorous at all. Why did I even say that? Sort of an odd point. Van Inwagen finds himself in the same situation I do. I mean, he doesn't put it this way. The way I put it is, I have no idea what to think about free will. But he goes through all the standard views and thinks that, sort of like William James, there isn't any resolution to this problem. But here's how he. Let's sort of read you the last, I think just the last paragraph. Yeah, well, a little more than the last paragraph. When all is said and done, I find myself with the belief that sometimes more than one course of action is open to me, and I cannot give it up. I can't give up that belief. As Dr. Johnson said, that's Samuel Johnson, in case you don't know, and if you don't know who Samuel Johnson is, find out. He's an important guy, very important guy. As Johnson said, "Sir, we know our will is free, and there's an end on it." Let's not discuss this, we already know. And I don't find, he says, right, that he sometimes, that he finds himself believing that he sometimes has more than one option. And I don't find the least plausibility in the hypothesis that this is an illusion, right? That's one place where he and I differ. I don't see what's so implausible about that. It's fairly wild, but the idea is that if you believe that the universe is deterministic, but you also think that you've got more than one option, then you've got to think that human beings are an exception to the rest of the universe, right? Somewhere along the line between amoebas and us, we got free will. But anyway, he doesn't find this plausible at all. It can sometimes seem attractive to hold the view that free will is an illusion. To think this, or to toy with the idea in a theoretical sort of way, oh well, never mind that. He's just explaining why you might fall into that. Because you don't, it's a way of getting yourself off the guilt hook, right? If you've done something bad, then it's nice to think you don't actually have free will, because you say, I couldn't help it. I mean, I couldn't do anything else. It was all determined from 10 million years ago. But anyway, so I will now get to the conclusion here. I conclude that there is no position that one can take on the matter of free will that does not confront its adherence with mystery. I myself prefer the following mystery. I believe that the outcome of our deliberations about what to do is undetermined, and that we, in some way that I have no shadow of an understanding of, nevertheless have a choice about the outcome of these deliberations. Parenthesis. And I do not believe that the concept of agent causation, Chisholm's idea, is of the least help in explaining how this could be. I accept this mystery because it seems to me to be the smallest mystery available. If someone believes that human beings do not have free will, then that person accepts a mystery, and in my view, it is a greater, deeper mystery than the one I accept. But others may judge the sizes of these mysteries differently. So you've got a choice between two mysterious views. One is that we're completely determined, and the idea, the impression we have that we have free will is just an illusion. The other mystery is that we have free will and we don't have a clue what that means. We don't understand the concept of free will, but we know we've got it. Right? So where I part from him basically is that it seems to me that both he and William James are mistaken. James thought you could go decide what to believe on the basis of how nice and attractive the view was. Van Inwagen thinks that you can choose whichever one leaves you with the smallest mystery. Choose, if you're gonna, when you believe something, pick the one that's a smaller mystery rather than the bigger mystery. And what I want to say to both of them is, why believe either? Why do you have to have an opinion on the subject? If you don't understand either one of them, both mysterious, then what the hell are you doing deciding I believe this, even though I don't really understand it? Okay, so that's the two reasons. I mean, the reason I wanted to put it on the syllabus is just because he does do a nice job of summing up practically everything I've said about these views. And then he does this funny thing, which is worth seeing a philosopher do. If you're desperate enough, you think you have to believe something, then you pick, the least ridiculous view you can and believe it. My sense is it's a much better idea to just back off and not indulge in endorsing mysteries. It's not a very nice place to be, but it seems to me to be a better place than, as they say, plumping for one mystery over another. Okay, so from now until the end of the term, we're going to be talking about questions of ethics or politics, issues of morality and political obligation. And we're starting with Plato's Euthyphro because the one way to put so the central question about moral theory is what makes the difference between right and wrong. Standard classical great moral theories have attempted to come up with some way to understand why right acts are right or why good acts are good, why wrong ones are wrong, bad ones bad. Moral judgment is a pretty serious part of our lives, and it would be nice to have some sense that when we're making moral judgments, we're not just expressing personal opinions or whims or whatever, that some of those judgments are true. But if you think that, then you face the question, what makes them true? The judgment that some act is immoral or wrong is not an empirical judgment. It's not a factual judgment about the way the world is that you can go out and check out. Right? It's some other kind of fact. Although one of the classical theories on this front does make it a kind of a fact. It's pretty hard to check out. But for the so-called utilitarians, it's a mouthful of a word, but you should know it whether or not you've ever had a philosophy class. It shows up everywhere. Utilitarianism is the view that the right act for some person to do is the act that maximizes the positive balance of effects on the whole human race. I mean, most of our acts don't affect very many people, but the right thing for any given person to do is a thing which maximizes the benefit in some sense of the greatest number of people. This is actually a fairly complicated view by now, but the driving idea is that the only thing that matters in assessing the morality, the rightness or the wrongness of people's behavior is human beings' well-being. Right? And so you're driven to think of the rightness as an act being right as maximizing the positive effects or the balance of the positive over the negative. And so, if that's how you think about it, then a moral judgment does, in a way, turn into a factual claim. You say that some act was right, you're claiming that of all the things that person could have done at the time, it was the one that maximized the balance of good over bad effects on human beings. And I suppose you could go try to figure out whether that's true or not. It wouldn't be easy. Among other things, you have to determine what are the good consequences and what are the bad consequences, which might already sound like another ethical question. But it's a fact that it's a judgment about the effects on human beings. And in principle, you might be able to figure that out. But other people think that utilitarianism is a pretty strongly deficient view, and the rightness or wrongness is not a function of that. It lives in a world of its own. Values, moral values, are independent of the natural world in some important sense. In which case, you have to wonder what could account for the difference between one act being right and another one wrong. What is it about them? And that's the question that Plato raises in the Euthyphro. It is, as he expounds it, of course, it's in the Greek context, and so he talks in their terms, but it shares with a lot of modern thinkers' views the idea that somehow the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, finds its source in God. For Euthyphro, that means it's among the gods of the Greek pantheon, starting with Zeus, but all the rest, right? That somehow the relation, the rightness or wrongness of Euthyphro's behavior, which is part of what's at issue here, is to be found in what the gods think of it. And in a lot of contemporary religious thought, the idea that roughly things are right because there are two choices: because God makes them right, made them right, or because God says they're right. And so I think they stopped. They didn't, for a couple of editions, they didn't include the Euthyphro in this text. I don't think anybody should start an intro course in philosophy talking about ethics without talking about this idea, because it's so common, so familiar to a lot of students, to a lot of us. So I'm going to follow Euthyphro through, and then point out how the identical question comes up. You just have to do a little bit of simple-minded translation, and you can turn it into a theory about a contemporary theory about the nature of morality in a monotheistic context, right, where the same God we talked about back at the beginning of the course is in question. Okay, so this all starts off by Plato setting up the scene here of these two meeting at the courthouse, where they're on different missions. Socrates is there to go on trial for corrupting the youth, and Euthyphro's there to prosecute his father. And so I'm not going to go through that setup, except to just point out that it's a classic Platonic setup, or at least in the so-called Socratic dialogues, in which Socrates feigns at least great respect for somebody else who apparently knows a whole hell of a lot about something that he would desperately like to know about and needs to know about in this case, but doesn't. Socrates needs to know what, and I'm going to I'll decide as I go along whether to stick with the term that's being used here. This is a fairly common translation of the Greek term. I'll probably drop it because it has such bad connotations. In the Greek world, this idea of piety it's a tangled religious and civic kind of concept. The city of Athens officially held services in honor of the Greek gods. I mean, it was actually a civic function to have these religious observances. So the link between the gods and the polity or the city or the population was very tight. And piety is clearly a virtue that you display if you're acting in accordance with the laws of Athens, which have themselves been arrived at by some kind of interaction with the gods, or by the gods helping the Athenians figure it out or whatever. So it's a quasi-religious, quasi-political kind of concept, okay? But now the term pious is used sarcastically most of the time. A pious person is somebody who's sort of phony religious attitude, right? Which is not at all what you want. So yeah, I will just decide, just decided, instead of talking about whether an act is pious or not, I'll refer to it a couple more times, in one point in particular. But instead of talking about the difference between pious and impious acts, I will just talk about the difference between right and wrong acts. Okay? It's actually close enough, given that this notion of piety was a central virtue expected of Athenian citizens, and certainly it's a central issue in Socrates' trial. The question is whether or not he has done something wrong. He violated the laws of Athens in this particular way by corrupting the youth. And the way he corrupted the youth, supposedly, had to do with calling into question Athenians' belief in these gods. Right? I mean, Socrates, as he says in here, has a whole lot of trouble believing that there are beings that deserve to be called gods, or actually are gods, and they castrate each other and they swallow their own children and various pretty gross things. So, this is the kind of thing he's charged with. But we're just going to use right to cover the waterfront, okay? Now, Euthyphro is there, not specifically, I mean, this is why it's sort of a spectacular character. He's bringing a suit that almost anybody, apparently in Athens, might have been shocked to find anybody bringing, because he's accusing his own father of murder. Right? He's prosecuting his own father. In the course of so, Socrates makes a big deal out of this and says, man, if you're ready to prosecute your own father, you must be about as certain as anybody could be about how to tell right from wrong and whether or not somebody deserves prosecution. And Euthyphro says, absolutely, Socrates, I know this stuff inside and out, backwards and forwards, right? So he's got the perfect setup. So Socrates asks the question, which he knows he's going to be asked in his trial. Namely, what is a right act? What does it mean to say that some act is right or that it's wrong? And of course, it's the term pious. What is the pious? Is the actual question that Socrates asks. But what he's asking is, what is it for an act to be right? And Euthyphro's first answer is this. I'll just read you a couple of the operative sentences. I say that the pious is to do what I am doing now. The right thing to do is what I'm doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, blah, blah, blah. He can cite some authority to back him up on this view, because these people themselves think that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods. Yet they agree that he bound his father because his father had unjustly swallowed his sons, and that his father in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. Okay, so the gods, in the myths of the gods, you have this same kind of thing. Sons prosecuting their fathers for a wrongful act, which is what Euthyphro claims to be doing. So there's your answer, Socrates. Do the kind of stuff I'm doing. Do what I'm doing. And so Socrates checks up on sort of Euthyphro's understanding of what the gods are about, and in particular gets him to wants him to agree that there is warfare among the gods. These people have terrible fights about all kinds of things. Yeah, of course that's true. And Socrates says, okay, having gotten clear about that, let's go back to the question I asked you. I asked you what it is that an act's being right consists in. Right? What is it for an act to be right? And you didn't really tell me. What you told me was what you're doing now. But that's just an example of a supposedly righteous act or a pious act, right? And an example isn't going to do me any good. What I want to know is what it is that makes all right acts right. What's distinctive about right acts or pious acts? And there's a reference here to, and I'll just quickly mention it because it slides right by, an idea of Plato's. He's notorious in Western philosophy for having come up with the idea. This is going to sound pretty wild. Remember where this occurs in the history of philosophy, right? This is at the very get-go, almost. And you've got Plato's a mathematician, among other things, so he's used to thinking about abstract entities, triangles and quadrangles and stuff. And he develops this idea, which is not actually a stupid idea, that if you've got 15 different objects, and they're all the same kind of object, right? Let's say you've got 15 desks, right? Each of them is a desk, right? What makes it a desk? Well, it fits, we might say it fits the definition of a desk. Well, that doesn't do much for Plato. What he wants to say is, look, in order for something to be a desk, it's got to be like, well, let me talk about a triangle first. In order for something to be a triangle, it has to exhibit what Plato might call the essence of trianglehood, right? There's such a thing as the essence of being a triangle, the concept of being a triangle. And an object has to fit that concept if it's going to be a triangle. And he thinks that about a whole range of things, and he certainly thinks that about the good. He would say the same thing about the pious. The idea is that there's got to be what you can think of as the essence of piousness, and this thing actually has to exist in the way that the essence of trianglehood, the concept of trianglehood, has to have an independent existence. Something is a triangle because it resembles the concept, or it fits the concept. So there's this idea out there, right, that we're chasing after something that you want to call sort of the quintessence, the essence of piety. That's what Socrates is after. But you don't have to think in those terms. You just think in terms of the general idea of lots of different things being right means that they've got something in common. Okay? What is it that they have in common? What do right acts have in common? What is it that makes them all right? And that's not, you haven't told me that, Euthyphro. You just gave me an example. So Euthyphro comes up with an example. What is dear to the gods is pious, or what he later says, what the gods love, or what the gods approve of is pious, and what they disapprove of is impious, right? What they approve of is right, what they disapprove of is wrong. Socrates, having gotten Euthyphro to agree already, which he should, that there's, in the stories about the gods, you got all these wild kinds of violent disagreements. And Socrates now says, well, when we disagree, even human beings, nobody gets all hot and bothered about who's right if the question is how long some board is. We just go measure it. You don't get all hot and bothered about where something is located. You just go find it. When people get hot and bothered and get angry and threaten each other, there's a question of right and wrong somewhere in the vicinity. Wouldn't you agree, Euthyphro? Euthyphro says yes, of course. Euthyphro almost always says yes, of course. Now the same thing is true about the gods, Socrates says, right? And Euthyphro agrees. What they disagree about, all their disagreements are loaded disagreements. That's what makes them interesting stories, because there's violence involved, whatever. Right? They disagree about the rightness and wrongness of things. Socrates says, it turns out that if you pay attention to these stories, that the same things that are loved by the gods are also hated by the gods, namely the other gods, right? So, what? And since love is such a nice short word, and they do actually use it, I'll just use that as a term for approving of it or whatever. The right is what the gods love, so the wrong is what the gods hate. And the trouble is, as Socrates points out, that there are lots of things that fit both of these definitions. They're loved by some of the gods, they're hated by some of the gods. And so you get the result that some things are both right and wrong. They're right because gods approve of them, they're wrong because other gods disapprove of them or hate them. And then you get, I mean, Euthyphro has to admit that this does look like a problem. Sorry, let me find the, here's where he hangs up. So, Socrates says, it's not surprising if what you're doing right now, namely prosecuting your father, it wouldn't be surprising to find out that it was pleasing to Zeus, that Zeus loved it, but Cronus and Uranus hated it, and it was Hephaestus loved it and Hera hated it. Similar kind of situation. Hera dumped Hephaestus because he was ugly. He got rid of it. Anyway, right, so you're going to find gods on both sides of the question here, right? Zeus prosecuted his father. Right? So the idea is that Zeus would approve of what Euthyphro's doing. On the other hand, presumably Euthyphro's father thinks Euthyphro's not doing the right thing. He shouldn't be prosecuting me. He says, oh, I didn't do anything wrong. And so Zeus's father would have said the same thing. He would have disapproved of what Euthyphro was doing because it was what his son had done to him, which is also wrong. Then you get this interesting, fairly compact discussion. Let me just read you a little bit. Euthyphro says, I think, Socrates, that on this subject, gods would not disagree that whoever has killed someone unjustly should pay the penalty. Socrates, well now, Euthyphro, have you ever heard of any man maintaining that one who has killed or done anything unjustly should not pay the penalty? Have you ever heard any human being say that somebody did something wrong, but they shouldn't be punished? And Euthyphro says, they never stop arguing about this subject, here and in the courts, wherever. Because when they've committed many wrongs, when people have committed many wrongs, they'll do and say anything to avoid the penalty, right? So the idea is people who are being charged with a crime, even though they've done something wrong, will say, I haven't done anything wrong, and they'll defend themselves, right? And so they're going to get into disputes. Back to Socrates. Do they agree that they have done anything wrong, Euthyphro? And in spite of so agreeing that they nevertheless should not be punished? Are you saying that some people admit they did something wrong, but they're saying nevertheless they shouldn't be punished? Euthyphro says, no, they don't agree on that. So, the point here is that what everybody agrees on is that somebody who has done something wrong should have the penalty inflicted on them. Everybody agrees about that, including mass murderers. They just think they haven't done anything wrong, or they've claimed they haven't done any murdering or whatever. The question, however, is which things who has done wrong. So Euthyphro can describe what he's doing as rightly trying to inflict the penalty on his murdering father, his guilty murdering father. And his father would give a very different description of this, of what actually happened, which is a longer story, but he didn't actually stab him with a knife or anything. Anyway, he would describe it very differently and say, what I did was not wrong, right? And so you are wrong to be prosecuting me. Socrates gives him a hard time. I won't read you the description, but he comes up with this elaborate description of what, according to Euthyphro, his father did. A pretty lengthy description. And he says, you're going to stand there and tell me, Euthyphro, that all the gods would agree that this act that I just described is wrong? And Euthyphro sort of begs off. He says, well, that wouldn't be easy. I'll have to tell it to the jury, but it's a pretty big task. And so Socrates moves on. And he says this, if Euthyphro shows me conclusively that all the gods consider such a death as the one his father caused, such a death unjust, to what greater extent have I learned from him the nature of piety and impiety? Suppose you convince me that all the gods would agree with you about the wrongness of what your father did. What's that going to tell me still about what it is for something to be right or pious? It's just another example, right? Or it's actually the same example coming up again in a different context. So Socrates moves on and asks this. Is this the correction we're going to make in our discussion? Is this what you want to try to say now, right? To get out of this problem about things being both pious and impious, right and wrong. that what all the gods hate is impious, and what they all love is pious, and that what some gods love and others hate is neither or both. Is that what you really want to say? Maybe even what you want to say in the first place? And Euthyphro gratefully accepts this idea because it gets him off this hook. So you now get this idea that the right is what all the gods love, and the wrong is what all the gods hate. If the gods are unanimous, right, in loving this act, then that's what it's being right consists in. If they all hate it, then that's what it's being wrong consists in. And we'll just, all the other ones where there's any kind of disagreement, we'll just leave those out of the discussion, right? We'll deal with them maybe some other time, right? For the sake of getting at least a reasonably clear concept of what Euthyphro is proposing, right? Just deal with the two unanimous cases. If all the gods love it, that's what it's being pious or right consistent, and the opposite for what all the gods hate. That's what it's impiety or wrongness consistent. And at that point, you arrive at the interesting philosophical question that Socrates now plunges into. What you get now is a discussion of sort of what explains what, right? And this can be a little bit hard to follow. I'm sure those of you who tried it, you found it a little bit hard to follow, but that's okay. We can get clear about the part that we need. Some things have the property. Here's one of the examples that Socrates uses. Suppose you've got a dog on a leash. You're leading the dog, right? The dog has the property of being led. It's being led by you. So it's got that property. If you've never heard of a property like that, yeah, it's a property, right? It's something that can be predicated as said of the dog. It's being led on its walk, right? And you are leading it. Now, which way does the explanation go? Does the fact that the dog is being led explain the fact that you're leading it? Or does your leading the dog explain the fact that it's being led? And the idea is that it's the second one, right? That the fact that you are leading the dog on the leash is what explains the fact that the dog is being led. If you weren't leading it, it wouldn't be being led. But it's being led doesn't explain why you're doing it, right? So he goes through several examples like this, and Euthyphro seems to get the idea. He has a little trouble with it, which is okay. But the reason he's doing this is that he's coming up to the big question that Euthyphro has to confront. Right? And this is the question. Let me come at it this way, right? I'll stick with the gods. If the gods love, let's say, why not? Prosecuting murderers. Do they love it? Because murdering is wrong, or is murdering wrong? Because the gods, sorry, yeah, well, it's okay, but, yeah, it's okay, but it's unfortunately it's going to be longer than I expected. Do they love it because prosecuting murderers is right, or is prosecuting murderers right because the gods love it? Okay, so I just wanted to take Euthyphro's own situation as the thing in question. You're right. Euthyphro obviously thinks that the gods approve of what he's doing, they love what he's doing, so they love the act of prosecuting murderers. And so Socrates says, okay, if they do, then tell me this, right? Do they love it because prosecuting murderers is right? Is that what explains why they do it? Or is prosecuting murderers right because the gods love it? Does the fact that they love it explain why it's right? Okay? You got two, in this case, both of these make sense, or at least they seem to some people to make sense. So take an example, a familiar example now. We'll switch to the modern world and take an example from the Ten Commandments. Okay? Let's switch from killing to thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay? So here the idea is that God's telling the Israelites not to commit adultery. Presumably the idea is that committing adultery is wrong. So now comes this question. God forbids adultery. Let's look. Yeah. How do we want to put this? Yeah. Hang on a second. Let's stick with the hate and love. It's not common in talking about God and the commandments. This is usually called the divine command theory word around now. But let's talk about hate and love, just to stick with this language. There's no reason not to. Does God hate adultery because adultery is wrong? Or is adultery wrong because God hates it? There are plenty of folks who think, you can hear this on a regular basis, that if there were no God, then nothing would be right or wrong. Somehow it's God's existence, God's attitudes, attitudes I guess is the right thing, to various acts that makes them right or wrong. Let me leave it there for the moment, and then actually put up here, if I can track it down here, just to be fairly efficient about this. What you've got is, at this point from Euthyphro, he has bought a proposal that Socrates made. Okay, so it doesn't come from Euthyphro, but Euthyphro says, yeah, that's what I have in mind. Euthyphro started out with this idea that got him into trouble, right, because of the disagreements among the gods. The same thing would turn out to be both right and wrong, because some gods approved of it and some gods disapproved, some loved and some hated it. So Socrates comes up with this idea of the unanimous ones, right? If all the gods love it, that's what makes it right. and if they all hate it, then that's what makes it wrong. So, if you translate this into into a monotheistic context, you get this as an example of, as Euthyphro's idea, his theory about what it means for something to be right, okay? So, I'm switching now examples again, but loving our neighbors is right. That's another commandment, right? Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, I think. According to Euthyphro, this thing here, and I'm going to underline this in different ways just to, the means is important. But this statement, loving our neighbors is right, means that God commands us to love our neighbor. Okay? These two things mean the same thing. Yeah, I told you I was going to stick with the love-hate language that we had been using up to this point. But at this point, I've switched on you, and if you don't have a problem with it, I'm going to stay switched, because otherwise what we would wind up saying down here is that God loves, that loving our neighbors is right means that God loves our loving our neighbors. Well, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should do that. Sympathy for you, so we stick with the same language, right? This is still Euthyphro's language now. Because God loves our loving our neighbors. Okay, so we still have essentially almost exactly what Euthyphro says in his own language, but we switch to God and we switch the example to loving our neighbors. But this is his idea, right? Translated into a monotheistic context. Euthyphro's actual definitions involve the gods unanimously, right, loving something or unanimously hating something. Well, as long as you're talking about a unanimous group, you might as well just be talking about one being. So that's why it carries over so easily. So to God, to the monotheistic God, you can talk about him as easily about this unanimous group of gods, what they all agree on, right? So it is exactly the same problem that Euthyphro raises. So there's his theory, right? What it means about saying that something is right. It means that God loves it. Right? Now, when Socrates asks Euthyphro this question, which of these is right, Euthyphro? Does God love our loving our neighbors because our loving our neighbors is right? Or is loving our neighbors right because God loves our loving our neighbors? And I'm going to actually write that out, the whole question out, and you'll see why in a minute. Right? Does God love our loving our neighbors? Because loving our neighbors is right. Or is loving our neighbors right. Because right. You can just write that love because God loves it, right? That is our loving our neighbors. Which is does he love this phenomenon of loving our neighbors because it's right? Or is it right because God loves it? And Euthyphro's answer to that question is the first. God loves our loving our neighbors because loving our neighbors is right. If you put in the standard way this is usually done, translate this into the command theory, God commands us to love our neighbors because loving our neighbors is right. The other alternative would have been loving our neighbors is right because God commands us to do it. Right? So Euthyphro seems to me, for what that's worth, to grab onto the right one here. Right? Which explains which? Right? Is the rightness of it explained by the fact that God loves it, or is the fact that God loves it explained by the fact that it's right? Which way does it go? And Euthyphro's answer is that God loves this stuff because he loves loving our neighbors because it's right. So, I'll just write it down one more time. I'll write out the whole thing. God loves loving our neighbors because loving our neighbors is right. Okay, that's the choice that Euthyphro makes between the two possible explanations. And here's what Socrates sticks him with. Right? Here comes the bombshell for this theory. For this theory here, right? This is his theory, and that's, as I was called, this is his theory about what the term means, and this is his claim about which explains which. Right? But these two things here mean the same thing. Loving our neighbors is right just means that God loves our loving our neighbors. And over here we've got loving our neighbors is right, shows up here, right? Loving our neighbors is right just means that God loves our loving our neighbors. They mean the same thing. It's a definition of what it is for something to be right is for God to love it. Right? So loving our neighbors is right just means that God loves our doing it. But if two different words or phrases or whatever mean the same thing, you can use whichever you want anytime you want to. Right? So you can talk about your bachelor uncle, or you can talk about your adult unmarried male, or your adult unmarried uncle. Right? Doesn't matter. The two things mean the same thing. So wherever one of these things turns up, if they mean the same thing, you can put the other one wherever it is, and still whatever you said is going to mean the same thing as it meant before. So now we're going to replace what we've already got over there is this one. Replace it with this one. And what happens? You get God loves our loving our neighbors because God loves our loving our neighbors. just replace one of these with the other. Instead of saying loving our neighbors is right, you say God loves our loving our neighbors, which means exactly the same thing. So now the whole thing just falls apart. You're saying something is true because it's true. God loves our loving our neighbors because he loves our loving our neighbors. Or to switch it the other way around, loving our neighbors is right because loving our neighbors is right. If these two things mean the same thing, then neither of them can explain the other because they say the same thing. It's like saying, what explains the fact that this guy's a bachelor? Well, the fact that he's an adult, unmarried human male. No. That's not an explanation. Right? What I want to know is why he hasn't been picked up before, why he hasn't married someone of some gender or other, whatever. I mean, is he broke or whatever. You can't explain something in terms of itself. Nothing explains itself. And so what you've got here is, this is actually, you might think this is not, this kind of problem is kind of a tricky philosophical problem that, that doesn't really show up in real theology. But that's not true. People who say such things as, if God didn't exist then nothing would be right or wrong, have some such idea in mind. I mean, whether God exists or not, adultery, murder, torture, whatever, these things don't change their nature. They are what they are. And the idea that they wouldn't be wrong if God didn't exist clearly means that their wrongness consists somehow in their relationship to God. And what Euthyphro's got here seems to me to be the right idea. Let's stick with the monotheistic context. It seems to me, in the monotheistic context, that this is the way to think about it, the way Euthyphro is. The reason the gods love this stuff is because it's good, it's right. The reason that God commands the Israelites not to commit adultery is because adultery is wrong. They might not realize that. They might need to be told this. This is why you get the commandments. That is to say, adultery is wrong in and of itself. There's something wrong about it, and that's why God commands them not to do it. The alternative, by the way, is this. If you think that something's being right or wrong, or something's being wrong, let's say, consists in God's commanding people not to do it, it's nothing about the act itself. It's the fact that God commands them, forbids them to do it, that constitutes the fact that it's wrong. That makes it sound very much as though God could have flipped the Ten Commandments over. I mean, it's his saying that something is right that makes it right. If it's his saying it's wrong that makes it wrong. So, God could have said, commit adultery every chance you get. Kill as many people as you want. Why don't you make some graven images to worship for a while? He would command these things. His commanding them would make them right. So it's that's for what it's worth. I mean that's my take on this. Right? Is the Euthyphro's got the right handle on this? The idea that pick your favorite, best or worst, saintly or dastardly act, the most atrocious thing you can think of, or the most noble thing you can think of. The idea being that they could switch places, right, on a view that says, well, they're not good or bad in themselves. It's because of God's attitude toward them or God's commandments about them or whatever that makes them good or bad. Yeah.
So on the topic of adultery, if you take out God out of the problem, but we still, I would feel like, adultery is a bad thing, but not relating to God, just my personal belief that shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm. Not taking into account that God says don't do it. It's my feeling of that situation does that have any implication on this matter?
Does your opinion have any implication on it?
Well, like, if you were in court and they bring up the God situation saying, like, God, says it's wrong, and so that's why you're being tried, but if God didn't say that and you're still being tried for it, I mean, what would be the outcome of that?
I can't really conjure up. Do you picture, you asked me to tell you what the average jury would say? What do I know? I wouldn't be optimistic. I mean, let me say what this, just something about where this leaves you. If you take Euthyphro's line here, right? If you take Euthyphro's line that the gods approve of things because they're right, then you're left with a question. If you're a philosopher, some philosopher is going to get curious at some point, as Socrates is, about what it is that makes right acts right. Right? That's his original question. What is it for something to be pious, or in our language, right? And so Euthyphro goes down the path of the relationship to the gods, and winds up in this problem. He's got a serious problem here because his explanation in any case just collapses, right? But if you at least buy his idea that when the gods do approve of something, they approve of something because it's right. Then the question, Socrates' question, is right there on the table, right? Interesting question. Here are these 17 different very kinds of acts that we all agree with. This is the right thing for this person to do. What do they share? Why do they all get to be called right? What does rightness consist of? That's what moral philosophy is about. Is an attempt to answer that question, to get clear about what these concepts are that we've got, and in terms of which we distinguish these things, and the hope, whether or not it is that we can figure out an answer to that question that allows us to, people of very different sort of persuasions, and just all kinds of disagreements, to get some agreement about what the concept of rightness is. So how you determine whether something is right. Then you can go have your fights about whether a particular act fits that concept or not. But the hope is that you can find that there's some way that all rational human beings with enough time to think about it, what it could be, would come to the same view of what this contrast is that we've got between right and wrong. Actually Plato had his own theory about it. Lots of philosophers have theorized about this. So I said that partly because I wasn't sure whether it would help you, how it related to the question you were asking, or whether it might, about your own personal opinion. I mean, there's no reason, even if philosophers could agree about, if the human race could agree about these two contrasting concepts of acceptable and unacceptable behavior or whatever, that it might be sufficiently abstract that you'd still wind up disagreeing about whether a particular bit of behavior was right or not. And so, moral questions are pretty complicated questions. So lots of things come to bear on them. But, that's all I want to say, was just that if you go Euthyphro's route, that the gods approve of things because they're right, then you're left with the question, the moral question, that Socrates starts out with: what does it mean for an act to be right or to be pious? If you go the other way, you don't have that question. If the idea is that what makes an act right is the fact that God approves of it, so that if there were no God, nothing would be right or wrong, then you have this apparently weird consequence, disastrous consequence, that God's choice of the things to command and to forbid was essentially arbitrary. I mean, these things aren't, there's nothing intrinsically right or wrong about these things. They just, these go on this list and these go on that list. And the only thing that makes them right is that they're on that list where God put them. Yeah.
Isn't route B the route where, God loves us loving our neighbors because he commanded us to love our neighbors? Isn't that slightly harder to stomach because it seems very egocentric from God's point of view, rather than, because you've got him saying, this is wrong because I said so, rather than I've created right and wrong, I'll let you feel it out.
Let me just look at that a second. So the idea is that, right, you substitute for this one instead, right?
Because B seems less
Right.
tasteful.
That's not what I want, right? Yeah, God. Yeah, sorry, we got away from that. We got into the command thing now. So here we've got, he loves this, he loves our doing this because he loves our doing it. The alternative is to say, loving our neighbors is right because loving our neighbors is right. What was the version you just said?
There was that route, the first route, and the other route where it did, because the one he chose was he loves us because it's, or he loves us loving our neighbors because it's right. The other one, he loves us loving our neighbors because he commanded us to love our neighbors. Doesn't that second route seem less tasteful and harder to...
But commanding us to love our neighbors was a substitute for loving.
Right.
Switched all. Yeah, so if you go to talk in the command world now, you say he commands us to do this because it's right.
Or rather, it's he loves it because he commanded us to.
Yeah, that's what you can't do. The loves and the commanding is a substitute for loving.
It's
just you're just changing two ways of talking about the problem. There's the loving that does it, or there's the commanding that does it. And on the other side, you have to say right.
There's no always right.
No, I mean because as you say, they're just two different characterizations of what God's doing that is responsible for this, whether it's because he loves it or because he's commanding it or whatever. But if you do the command one, you do get the thing you were just saying. God commands us to do X because X is right. Now suppose those two mean the same thing. God commands us to do X because he commands us to do X, right? That's not God talking, right? He's not saying that I'm commanding you to do this because I'm commanding you to do it. It's just our way. We're trying to get clear about which explains which. He's commanding, it makes it right, or he's being right, it's why he commands it. And so it really is just an explanatory thing. The idea is God commands it because God commands it, which is just incoherent. Yeah. Okay, folks, we're gonna next time I'm going to start out by talking about the cultural relativism, but that's the background developments to your next essay by Martha Nussbaum. This is an interesting essay about a huge current problem still in some parts of the world. You should try wrapping your minds around it. The paper assignment? Certainly may.
It must be difficult not getting chalk on your clothes.
All right, I'm quite unsuccessful with that.